Alexander and the Hellenistic kingdoms. The objectives for this are 1. Analyze how, under Alexander, Macedonians and Greeks conquered the Persian Empire, and 2, characterize Hellenistic cities. Now, beginning with the trajectory of this rise of the Macedonian state, we saw that after the Peloponnesian War, the Greeks had been fighting with one another, but at the same time, the Macedonian state had been rising to prominence. The Greeks viewed their northern neighbors, these Macedonians, as barbarians, not truly Greek, not truly civilized. And they were, in a true sense, very different. They were a rural people. They were organized in groups, not in city-states. Why? Because the geography was different in the Macedonian region. In southern Greece, of course, in Greece proper, we see islands and separated by mountains and so this fostering of city-states made sense. But here, in an more open region in Macedonia, it allowed for the development of a true kingdom. And so Macedonia became, by the 5th century, a true, powerful kingdom with a king. And in 359 BCE, the most famous, Philip II, came to the throne, and he built a powerful army based around a new military structure, along with the pike and new methods that conquered those that he fought with. But his ultimate goal was to unite all of Greece under Macedonia. So he defeated the Athenians at the Battle of Chaeronea, and he battled these people and he dominated them, and ultimately brought the various Greek states and their representatives to a meeting in which they would, in a certain sense, subjugate themselves to him. Now, Philip quickly gained control of all these Greek city-states and planned an invasion along with them of Persia, dominating that region. So we see the Macedonians rising in great power. But his son, Alexander, later named Alexander the Great, was 20 when his father was assassinated. And it's unclear who assassinated him, whether it was coin from the Persians or the Greeks who actually disliked him, or a disgruntled mother of Alexander, but who Philip, of course, had taken a new wife. It's unclear any of those things, but under this context, then, Alexander was thrust into kingship and became the king of Macedonia and control over the Greek city-states at the young age of 20. Now, Alexander was motivated by the desire for glory and empire. Again, in fact, he took much of his examples and his desires from Homer's epics. Homer's epics, of course, had a huge impact on Greek society, as we've seen before. In fact, it's said that Alexander even slept with a copy of the Iliad underneath his pillow. So, he, after had become the ruler and after the king, decided to execute Philip II's plans for an invasion of Persia. And though some people believed he was too young, he was set upon this goal. He believed that he could unite the world in a true sense. And here we see a map of the world according to Herodotus, whom had written before his time. And this was how the Greeks saw the world and what they believed it looked like. So here we can see the Greeks right almost in the middle of the map. He believed that he could conquer Asia Minor, head out across the Middle East, head to India, circle back around in the sea, and up to the Nile. And this was something he believed that he could do. He didn't realize the world was as big as it ended up being. But to him, it seemed a very reasonable thing to do, to conquer the known world. And that's what he set out to do. Although we're weakened, Alexander conquered and attacked Asia Minor with an army of 37,000 Macedonians and Greeks. Alexander had freed the Ionian Greek states of the Western Asia Minor, where the Persians had continually fought back and forth, taking over those regions. So he conquered them, driving the Persians back into their own territory. And he built Alexandria in Egypt after he conquered Egypt itself. He was named Pharaoh, and he built Alexandria after his own name. And so he sets out on his massive conquest of the East, pushing further and further eastward. And it was in 331 BCE that Alexander turned east and fought the decisive battle against the Persians at Gargamella. And it's here that he drove the Persian king into retreat as Alexander came so close to defeating him. So over the next 3 years, Alexander moved eastward and northeast as far as modern Pakistan. He had taken Babylon itself. Prior to that, had been named the Babylonian king, right? He had become the Persian ruler over all of those regions, and he was absorbing all of these different territories, ultimately to go into the Indus River Valley system. And by the time he had reached the Indus River, going into, and here's the cusp when you go into India, many of his troops had believed that they had gone too far. And this will inevitably lead to great distrust. Now here's ultimately the territory that Alexander ends up conquering and controlling. He attempts to go into India, but of course this is a much different terrain and fights dense jungled peoples and faces elephants, which he had never faced before to this time. So you could see his activities with these green arrows as he kind of migrates and looks for a path to the east. A great, huge empire, probably in terms of the length, about the size of the United States. Now, the legacy of Alexander. Alexander ultimately died as a result of a couple different factors. It's unclear whether he was exhausted from wounds in India, which he was struck with an arrow, hit with fever, poisoned even, some have theorized, or was notoriously a drunkard, so maybe he drank too much. It's unclear. He was a great military leader, that seems clear, a master of strategy and tactics, but also benefited, of course, from his father's plans and from his father's strategy and how to control and defeat the Persians. Alexander sought to imitate Achilles, as was said earlier. He extended Greek and Macedonian rule over a vast area and brought into contact the Persian world and the Eastern world with the Greek world. Alexander's successors tried to imitate him, but to no avail. They used force and the claim of divinity and a divine rule like he had in other places, but ultimately others created monarchies and followed new patterns that Alexander had not. When he did die, of course, those main generals that followed him split apart and divided up the kingdom, and these became known as the Hellenistic kingdoms. Now, the Greek language, architecture, literature, and art spread throughout Southwest Asia and the Near East, all over the place. And we see a melding or mixing of these cultural traditions and religions. From Alexander, a Hellenistic era was created. That is, Hellene, which means Greek specifically. But here, under the Hellenistic era, what we're talking about is a blending between the Eastern traditions, the Eastern world, and the Greek world. And so he united the empire that Alexander created, but it ultimately fell apart after his death, leading to the creation of the four major kingdoms that developed in his wake, led and governed by four major generals. The Macedonian kingdom, which was, of course, that traditional kingdom right above Greece. You have the Syrian kingdom, the kingdom of Pergamum, and Egypt itself. And so Alexander's dream was to fuse ultimately the Macedonians, the Greeks, and the Persians all into one monolithic kind of kingdom. In fact, there's one famous story when he was taking a wife or presiding over the union of one of his soldiers with a Persian wife, which he held up a cup of 2 cups, and he poured them into one basin and said, "With this, just like this, I mix the people into one." And that was his dream, that he would create a unified people together, not barbarian and Greek and Macedonian per se, but one unified people culturally and politically. Now, the Hellenistic culture in general reflects that merging of these traditions. Alexandria in Egypt, for example, became home to poets and writers and philosophers and scientists. A massive library was built there, the Library in Alexandria, which became the largest in ancient times. In fact, it was boasted that it had 5,000 scrolls, and in fact, behind it, a museum, the first of its kind. In fact, there were so many devices and different tools and inventions that resided in the back of this museum that it really, if it had been conceived, they could have built a steam engine. They had piston systems and steam-powered devices. They had all kinds of things devised and developed. It was a center of great learning, but ultimately burned to the ground. Of course, architecture, sculpture, and literature also emerged in different forms during the Hellenistic region and the Hellenistic kingdoms. So both Hellenistic kings and rich citizens patronized sculptures. They hired sculptors to create new works of art, and thousands of statues were created from the wealth that came from the Middle East. But many of these were a blend between Greek and Persian forms. And this produced, of course, at this time, enormous quantity of literature as new poets and authors ended up with new stories to tell and new patrons to pay them. You have all kinds of examples, like Apollonius of Rhodes, who wrote the epic poem called Agronautica, which is the famous Jason and the Golden Fleece. You also have, of course, major developments in science. Considerable advances can be mentioned in astronomy and mathematics. For example, Aristarchus of Samos. He developed a theory in which the sun is at the center of the universe rather than the traditional Ptolemaic model, which was that the earth was. And the earth rotates around the sun rather than the sun rotating around the earth. This was later on, of course, abandoned, but this was a major theory. Eratosthenes determined that the earth was round and calculated almost exactly as it is, which is an amazing feat. Or Euclid, most famous for his work in the Elements, a textbook on plane geometry, which was important all the way up into the modern era. Or Archimedes, who specialized in geometry of spheres and cylinders, calculated pi, and even studied the displacement of water and buoyancy. So these during this Hellenistic era, we see an explosion of scientific and literature developments. And philosophy is no different. Athens remained the center of philosophy in the Hellenistic world as well, but began to merge other views. Epicureanism, for example, emerged at this time. And it established a school in Athens arguing that human beings were free to follow self-interest as a basic motivating force for the universe. In fact, this was where people believed that life was short, and embrace your passions, live your life, do the things that drive you. So this was really at the core of what was moral in the Epicurean model. Well, Stoicism was completely the opposite. Stoicism, which was created by Zeno, was concerned with how to obtain happiness, but of course, this was only through self-discipline and through hard work and harmony in life. And to them, happiness could be found only where people gained inner peace by living in harmony, but embraced politics and embraced a sort of stoic life, is where the word comes from. Disciplined. Now, the objectives, just to remind you again, 1, analyze how under Alexander, Macedonians and Greeks conquered the Persian Empire, and then 2, characterize the Hellenistic states.